No? Oh, there we go. We're on.
They're on.
Good morning, everyone. So following on from the press conference just before, we'll still be working on SDGs for the SDGs, so looking at students doing goal-orientated science for the Sustainable Development Goals. So now we will be looking at Goal 13, which is climate action. So just a quick introduction of myself. I'm Morgan Rossiter. I'm a student at Monash University, and I'm completing a master's in environment and sustainability. So we will be looking at Goal 13, which is climate action. So I'm sure everyone here today is well aware of the importance and the urgency of this topic. And so fortunately, I'm joined by two seniors from Colorado State University who'll be sharing their research on the topic. So presenting today, we have Tamara Breidenbach, who's completing a bachelor's degree in ecosystem science and sustainability. Tamara would like to go into policy analysis following her degree, and she's currently planning on attending graduate school for environmental policy, specifically relating to public lands and natural resources. Also have Natalie Hodgman, who is studying ecosystem science, sustainability and political science. After graduation early next year, Natalie's planning to go into agriculture and environmental policy. So building on Goal 13, Natalie and Tamara will be presenting briefly on their research undertaken on different adaptation strategies in mountain communities. But before I hand over to Natalie and Tamara, I'm going to introduce my co-moderator today, August DeVore from Clark University. August is a graduate student at Clark University studying environmental science and policy. And I'll now hand over to August.
Thank you so much. So also collaborating on this project were Clark students in their first year master's program in environmental science and policy, Priyanka Shrith, Ruhua Jing, and Zihan Wang. And so they weren't able to be here today, but they did as much work on this, and they're excited for this as well. So I'm also excited to connect these things to our own campus and hear the ways in which that we could increase our own sustainable efforts. So thank you. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I just want to first start off and say that anything that we discuss today is our personal views and not reflective of people that we work for. So we focused, as you know, on Sustainable Development Goal number 13, and we wanted to see how adaptation strategies are being used in mountain communities across the world and how they could be used to combat the effects of climate change. And so we compiled research from different communities from around the world and looked at adaptation and resiliency strategies. And we found a common problem of all these communities that they appear to face that was due to increased water variability and the result of decreased glacial mass and variability in their water cycles that were induced by climate change. The intent of our study was to identify these commonalities among the adaptation strategies that are being used in the mountain communities currently.
The first case study we examined in this review was one that looked at the problem of conserving freshwater springs in the Kalimpong district, West Bengal of India. Climate change has caused the drying of many freshwater springs, which are a primary water source for many people living in this area of the Himalayas. This study researched the geolithology and hydrology of the area and concluded that critical springs, which are ones that are the main water source for a greater network of springs, are drying up. However, to solve this issue, the study advocates for an integrative approach to water management that involves many stakeholders to achieve an adaptive solution. The second case study we examined looks at the role of traditional ecological knowledge in mountain communities. This study addresses how traditional ecological knowledge can aid indigenous communities in adapting to climate change. It further assesses how climate change will put pressure on indigenous institutions, but also how traditional ecological knowledge can be used in science policy. The findings of this study demonstrate how an exchange of knowledge between parties can create better, more adaptive climate policy. Our third case study assesses pastoralist practices in the Peruvian Andes Mountains. Looking at pastoralist practices in Peru in comparison with anthropologic findings provides insight on how pastoralism has changed over time. This study sought to determine what livestock would be the most favorable under the conditions of climate change. The findings show that alpacas, given that they have evolved in the Andes Mountains of Peru, are a superiorly equipped animal to raise in this ecosystem. Further, the findings suggest that alpacas can be used as an ecosystem-based adaptation.
Okay, and before I talk about my research project, I want to give some context to wetlands before I discuss them as an ecosystem-based adaptation strategy. So wetlands are a minor part of Earth's biosphere, but they play a major role in ecosystem health and resilience of the system as a whole. The value of wetlands relies on their extent, their position in the landscape, the degree to which their ecosystem is open to influences from water and other components, and the proximity to human settlement. Depending on these variables, wetlands provide different ranges of quantifiable benefits to the environment and to society. One of the most valuable benefits of wetlands is their ability to store floodwaters. Maintaining only 15% of a landmass area of a watershed in wetlands can reduce flooding peaks by as much as 60%. For example, the Wetlands Initiative did a study for 18 months that was called Flood Damage Reduction in the Upper Mississippi River Basin, an Ecological Means. This study revealed that restoring the 100-year flood zone of the Upper Mississippi State Watershed could store 39 million acre-feet of floodwaters, the volume that caused the Great Flood of 1993, and could save over $16 billion in projected flood damage cost. So why is this important to the Rocky Mountains of Colorado? The state of Colorado currently is estimated to have lost over 50% of its historical wetland acreage due to climate change stressors and indicators like the invasive mountain pine beetle, massive numbers of dead tree stands, and increased probability in occurrence of wildfires and flooding. The loss of wetlands is an increasing threat. Colorado wetlands would provide water storage during floods, buffering Colorado's working lands, cities, and towns from flood damage. There stands a need to protect Colorado's communities and their economic viability in the future by mitigating flooding and providing clean water. In my summer research project with the Colorado Science and Engineering Policy Fellowship at the Colorado State Capitol, I focused on constructing a policy proposal that would ensure no loss of wetland acreage and would create a framework to restore historical wetland areas. This included a statewide focus on wetlands as a climate adaptive solution and a collaborative management strategy between private and public partnerships. This multi-part proposal encompassed proposed changes to state statutes, a creation of a grant to fund restoration projects, conservation easements, and the before-mentioned private-public partnerships. It also sought to establish an initial study to designate specific wetland areas and to offer buffer recommendations for Colorado communities. Policy changes like this proposal can be used in the local and state level for mountain communities to adapt to climate change and to focus on ecosystem-based adaptation strategies.
This review that we conducted demonstrates that mountain communities face a variety of challenges in the face of climate change. Some common themes throughout these case studies were how policy can be shaped to fit local needs, and how traditional and indigenous knowledge can be used to create climate adaptive solutions. To conclude, we would like to point out that the risks and problems faced by mountain communities can be solved with local climate adaptive solutions.
Thank you both. I know spending this week with you both learning more about these adaptive strategies has been really interesting for me, and I think on this topic of the climate action that's required, it was really good to hear. So before any questions on the bench, I'll open it up to the floor if anyone has a question for either of the girls. Yeah, Peter, we've got a mic.
Thank you for your presentation. Actually, I have a question about the time phrase. When you talk about restoring the wetland, like how long does it take? Is it 1, 3, 10 years? Could you just elaborate a bit on that? Thanks.
So restoring a wetland depends on the wetland itself. There are multiple different types of wetlands. In fact, wetlands are defined in very various ways depending on whether you're looking at a federal definition, if you're looking at a scientific-based definition for an institution, if you're looking at it, there are multiple different ways you can define it. So actually restoring it depends on the current status of the wetland, how degraded it is, where it's at, the type of inputs and outputs that it has. So it's not necessarily a time frame, but it's more in looking at the system and how it's being impacted and developing changes that help restore it to its natural functioning ability.
And I actually just have a follow-up on that one as well. For me, wetlands are sort of, I've always thought is very, very different in Australia, sort of the coastal interpretation I have of wetlands. So I've been quite interested to sort of learn about it from the mountain context. And I wanted to understand, how did you get, I suppose, excited and involved to sort of look further into wetlands? And how do you think that could be replicated out into communities to further increase awareness about the importance of wetlands?
So that's a really great question. I got interested in wetlands because I went to Peru with my mentor, Dr. Gillian Bowser, and we were learning about high alpine bofedales in the Andean mountains and seeing how glacial changes there have impacted wetlands and trying to figure out where the inputs for them are and looking at the different influences on the wetlands in those mountains got me interested in the policy context of wetlands and what I could do coming from a Western nation in what my decisions do to impact places around the world. And I had the opportunity to work with the Colorado Natural Heritage program on my senior project in school and look specifically at wetlands there. So it has been a developing interest and one that I think that wetlands overall have, as I have seen, have been very much undervalued in how important they are and how critical they are into establishing an ecosystem community. So that's where my passion developed, and then seeing how in my local home state that they had been degraded and wetland acreage had been taken away, but how that could potentially impact communities, especially in Colorado with the impacts of the pine mountain beetle and with the dead tree stands and wildfires, and how that system impacts flooding, and wanting to make a change in my local community on that issue.
Great. That actually brings up a question that I sort of had during your presentation. Because Clark University is located in a very different area than Colorado State, though we do have some mountainous areas, it's nothing compared to Colorado. I was wondering, what are some ways that other students or community members might be able to implement some of this research? Or learn more about the Western and traditional ecological knowledge nexus. So sort of learning a little bit more about this topic as a whole, because it's really complicated. So where can we look to find out more about it?
So I was very fortunate in that my college sponsored me to do a fellowship with our state capitol. Water law is very complicated in the United States, in particular in the Western United States, due to the prior appropriation doctrine. And so over the summer, I had to take my technical background in science and apply it to researching and understanding the actual laws that exist around wetlands and understanding water pathways. So I think that taking, as a student, the only way that I can speak to that is that taking your technical background and your knowledge and applying it and looking at local practices, because water law is so different. Wetlands are defined very differently, and where you live at, they can be very different. So it's very much, I think, a benefit because you can look at it more on a local level and understand it better.
Are there any more questions? Yes, we've got one. Gillian, you've got a mic. Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian Bowser, Colorado State University. I was actually really interested in on the ecosystem adaptation and the role of alpaca. And I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit more about how alpaca become part of the pastoralist response for resistance. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So my review that I conducted looking at this, I did a lot of research about the history of pastoralist systems in Peru, and I learned how things have changed over time with colonization of the area, where communities thousands of years ago raised alpacas, and then when the Spanish colonized the area, they incorporated more European-centric agricultural practices, such as cattle and sheep, but those have persisted over time. However, cattle and sheep are less well adapted to living at high elevation ecosystems because they are more equipped for the lower level areas. Specifically, cows are susceptible to a disease at high elevation, and sheep also are not as hardy as the alpaca. And so because of the better fit that the alpaca serves the pastoralists in Peru, they become an ecosystem-based adaptation because they are aligned with a lot of the traditional knowledge in the area, and ecosystem-based adaptations draw on that kind of knowledge to be able to adapt to climate change and be more readily able to adjust with a changing climate. And so alpacas can do that because they are so well equipped for the ecosystems of Peru, the Andean ecosystems of Peru, that they're a natural fit for pastoralists to raise.
So I had one more question before we take any more, because you spoke a little bit about the policy end, and my background is in policy, and especially water policy, especially in the US, very complex. So could you elaborate a little bit more on the specific strategies that you would like policymakers to take regarding this topic, and if you have any further suggestions for policymakers?
Yeah. So in the proposal that I constructed, I looked at making changes to our state statutes because they define wetlands as hazards instead of the beneficial ecosystems that we know that they are. And so I proposed changes to the state statute, and I also proposed changes in proposing an appropriation to create a funding for a conservation fund for wetlands in our state. And that fund itself would specifically look at giving monetary benefits to programs that looked at restoration that were private and public, so that it incentivized those partnerships to happen. And then I also looked at giving funding to the Colorado Natural Heritage Program because they have a specific wetlands program, and looked at mapping wetland areas in the state because wetland mapping is, the data is there, but it is lacking and needs to be updated. And so by giving them funding to create this database, then we could structure it in the state because of political consensus to create a Tier 1 and Tier 2 strategy into defining wetlands in the state. The Tier 1 would be wetlands that are considered invaluable, that need to be protected at like a very high benefit to society. And then the Tier 2 would be wetlands that would be either seasonal or were connected to like different things. I left that up to CNHP to determine how they wanted to define them, and then also to give suggestions to buffer areas, since the main goal of my research was to protect Colorado communities and their economic viability so that those barrier areas would be able to protect communities. Because when you have a barrier buffer area that is too close to an urban zone, it can actually become degraded and non-beneficial. So those buffer areas are incredibly important. And so that is another strategy that I looked at implementing in my proposal for communities and for the state to look at. And I think it would be very beneficial.
Thank you so much.
If there are any other questions in the audience, yeah, grab another mic.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. First of all, I want to express my gratitude for bringing the developing countries' perspective into the presentation as well. And me coming from Himalayas, like north, from the mountains where we are affected by variability of water supply, because everything is like planned for downstream, and upstream it's very difficult for people to get access to water, and if water comes, it comes in form of floods. So my question is like for the panel itself, like if you can suggest how this collaboration could be increased, that policies and technical expertise which is present in the developed world, it can be implemented in lower income and lower middle income countries. Like how can this collaboration between research institutes and policy makers can be improved? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think that's a very important question. That's what I plan to do in my future career. So I think that there does exist a gap between policy and between research in a lot of ways, and that research could be used in more significant ways. And so I think that breaking down the barriers, that you have to be an expert in either or, that you can't be an expert in both, or you can't offer valuable insight, is a barrier that needs to be taken down. And I think younger researchers are seeing that. We see how incredibly important it is to address the climate crisis as it is right now, and not waiting 5 years, 10 years to address it, because that will be too late. So I think younger researchers are realizing that and are making the initiatives to create that collaboration ourselves and do the work that needs to be done.
And I've got to agree with Tamara there. I think it's so important to find ways that we can keep connecting science and industry and policy. And I know that's something that's really big at my university, at Monash. Myself, I work in the energy industry, and I'm working, and I'm studying sustainability science. And I think we need to keep finding those ways to create the nexus and pushing down those boundaries that historically were there with more niche science, finding ways that we can just keep, keeping our voices heard, but ensuring that we're crossing the channels that historically were a bit more structured.
And also, I would add on to both of you amazing points, to take it a little bit further, also having an addition of the civil society as well as the private sector and the public sector is really, really important to create this communication. So they both brought up the fact that we need to break down these barriers, and one of the best way to do that is by going through all of the different sectors, because with the civil society, there's a lot more communication among the sort of non-experts. While there are still many experts in civil society, there is more of an open flow of communication. And so it comes down to creating spaces where all of these groups can come together and create plans as one, so create initiatives as one cohesive group. So I think that addressing all the different sectors and making sure not to leave one out is really important, and that will go across the board between both Western and developing nations.
Yeah.
Any more questions in the consideration of time? Anything else in the audience? So I guess I would just have one final question for all three of you on the panel. This project has been a real collaboration amongst universities, and is there any really key learning you've got that you'd recommend for other students working towards Goal 13 climate action that you'd like to share?
Can you just repeat the middle part of that? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. There's been such a lot of cross-university collaboration on this project, working towards Goal 13, and just any final insights or any final sort of key takeaways you found that were really important that you think could help other university students with their research?
Yeah, so I think definitely listening to everyone's story and everyone's opinion is really important when working with other people. We worked a lot with our Clark colleagues via Skype, which is difficult at times, but it just reminded you to take things slow and listen, don't, be respectful of other people. And I think that's really important when engaging with others, especially your colleagues in school, because, you want to make connections with people that last.
And then I'll also say that we are so lucky to be living in a time where technology is advanced and we can do things like Skype. And so as students, we are also lucky with all the resources that we have available to us. So really just trying to utilize as many resources as you can. Talk to your advisors. Your advisors know people all over the world. And that's huge because they will get you connected to universities that you've never even heard of with opinions that they've never even heard of, just to go off of that point. And so I think that it can be difficult, but just try to break through that regular stream that you're kind of put through and try to find as many resources as you can because we are so lucky to have them.
Yeah, great points. I really agree with that. We are very, very fortunate with the support we get. So that's all we have time for today. So thank you everyone for your participation and your questions. Really insightful hearing about the work that students are doing, the goal-orientated science within the SDGs. So a big thank you to Colorado State University and Clark University. As I said, I'm from Monash University. This has been a really enjoyable task of collaboration across different universities. Also a big thank you to the National Science Foundation for their support across this project. And enjoy the rest of your COP, everyone. Cheers.